All right, everyone, buckle up. Today's deep dive is a juicy one. We're talking gender disparities in law enforcement.
Always a hot topic.
It is. And we're going deeper than just who gets stopped more often. We're talking about the length of police stops, which, get this, can actually reveal a lot about potential bias.
Absolutely.
Data on the screen, numbers come alive. Male, female flows where the patterns thrive. Visual charts, public colors unify. Gender decoded, bringing truth to light. Small drum fill. We break it down, real talk. Trends unveiling facts from every block. Here's your insight, watch the data glide. Gender decoded, let the beats collide.
I mean, this is something that we see crop up in the news a lot, right?
Right.
Whenever there's like a high-profile police stop or incident, involving anybody these days, it seems like, it always raises this question of, is there some kind of bias going on here? And so to actually like dig into some data about this is really, I don't know, it's really interesting stuff.
Yeah, and that's what I love about this particular research is that we're actually looking at hard numbers here.
Right.
We're looking at the duration of police stops and how that differs between men and women.
Okay.
And I mean, I gotta say, like, at first glance, when I was looking at this, some of the stuff, it seems kind of like, okay, this seems pretty fair, Most police stops, whether you're a man or a woman, they're relatively short.
Uh-huh.
But then it gets really interesting because the research goes on to say that men are way more likely to experience these super long stops. We're talking over 10 minutes.
Yeah.
What's going on with that?
Well, that's the big question, right?
Yeah.
I mean, that's kind of what this research is trying to figure out is because if you see a pattern like that, right, where it's okay, most of the time it's the same, but then every once in a while there's this big disparity. You have to ask the question, like, what is it about those particular situations? What is it about those longer stops that is leading to this difference? And one of the things that the research points to is the possibility that it's implicit bias.
Okay, so implicit bias for people who are not familiar with that term.
Sure.
Explain that a little bit.
Yeah, so implicit bias, it's kind of like, I'm trying to think of like a good way to put it. It's almost like you have these unconscious beliefs.
Yeah.
Right. Like, we all have our own unique experiences and upbringings and
things that we're exposed to throughout our lives. And those things can actually like seep into our subconscious and affect the way that we view the world and the way that we interact with other people, even if we don't consciously realize that those beliefs are there.
So you're saying just because someone is a man, they might automatically be viewed with a little more suspicion, even if it's not something that anyone's consciously thinking.
Yeah. And it's not even just limited to law enforcement, right? I mean, think about how often you see men portrayed as being aggressive or being involved in crime in like movies or TV shows or even just like in everyday conversations.
Right.
We use these kind of like shorthand stereotypes all the time. And even if we don't personally believe them or even if we're not actively thinking about them, they can still kind of like work their way into our subconscious, and then they can subtly affect the way that we perceive and react to men in particular. So it's not necessarily that a police officer is consciously thinking, oh, this person is a man, I'm going to treat them differently. But these deeply ingrained societal beliefs could be unintentionally shaping the way that they're behaving in those situations.
Exactly. And it's not just like a hunch or anything like that either. Like, there's actually research that backs this up. There have been studies that have shown that people in general, including police officers, tend to perceive men as being more threatening than women, even in situations where the situation itself is totally ambiguous.
Interesting.
And so if you have that underlying perception of threat, that can actually lead to longer, more scrutinizing interactions.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
So obviously there are a lot of different factors at play here, but it does really make you stop and think. If this type of bias can happen with something as serious as a police stop,
right,
could it also be seeping into other areas of our lives as well? I mean, just in our everyday interactions with people.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think this research really shines a light on just one example of how these kinds of unconscious biases can play out in the real world. And it really highlights how important it is for all of us to just be aware of these biases, We can constantly be questioning our own assumptions and making sure that we're treating everyone fairly, regardless of gender or any other characteristic.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Before we hit the gas on this deep dive, let's make sure everyone's buckled in and up to speed. Your research delves into what you call ticket stops versus non-ticket stops. So what's the difference?
Right. So a ticket stop, that's a more straightforward one. You're pulled over, there's a violation, you get a citation. Pretty self-explanatory. Now, a non-ticket stop, that's where things get more interesting. You're still stopped by an officer, but you're free to go without that lovely little ticket gracing your windshield. Could be a warning, maybe a license check, anything where you walk or, I guess, drive away without a fine.
Okay, so we've got our definitions straight. Now, where does this whole gender thing come into play?
So what's the data telling us? Like, are women more likely to get off with a warning or something?
Well, actually, the data shows that women are actually slightly more likely to be pulled over for something that results in a ticket.
Really?
Yeah, like 66% of women's stops end with a ticket compared to about 55% for men.
That is a pretty noticeable difference.
It is. But here's the thing. For those ticket stops, the data shows men and women both experience pretty much the same length of time for the stop itself.
So it's like if you're getting a ticket, the process is pretty much the same for everyone.
Seems that way.
Makes you wonder about those non-ticket stops, though. Then there's a difference there.
This is where it gets interesting. When it comes to those non-ticket stops, the data shows a significant difference in the length of those stops for women. On average, they tend to be longer than similar stops for men.
Huh. So is that like they're letting men go quicker, or what could be causing that kind of difference?
Well, it's hard to say for sure without more information. One possibility is that officers might be spending more time verifying things like vehicle registration or insurance details with female drivers.
Reason maybe they don't believe it's their car?
Well, it's possible, right? I mean, it's important to consider all the angles, but yeah, it could be something like that, or maybe there's some other procedural thing that takes longer. We don't really know without digging deeper into the specifics.
Yeah. I mean, I'd hate to think unconscious bias is playing a role, but I mean...
It's definitely a question worth asking.
Right.
Unconscious bias is something that can affect anyone, even in subtle ways. So it's definitely something to think about when you see these kinds of disparities in the data. The important thing is that we're having these conversations and really trying to get to the bottom of it.
Absolutely. Well, that was a fascinating look at a topic I honestly never really thought about before.
It's definitely interesting stuff. And it brings up a lot of questions. I mean, are these trends consistent across different states, different parts of the country? Are there other factors besides gender that could be contributing to these differences? I mean, this data is just scratching the surface. It'd be fascinating to see more research on this topic.
Definitely. Well, that's all the time we have for today's deep dive. But for all of you listening, think about this. What could be done to make traffic stops more consistent and less susceptible to any kind of bias? It's something to think about.
Yeah, that's a really good question. A lot to unpack there.
Thanks for listening.